Just a minor thing on the TV point. I'll just pick up a couple things you said. Well, I'll talk about the G20, I want TV, and I want to talk about the elders and House of Commons, or House of Lords. Though we didn't talk about TV because we were trying to address the so-called new challenges of the media. And the social media obviously changes, especially, you were talking about John Keane, especially in China. Especially the enormous explosion of Sina Weibo in China, where so many millions of people are griping at the government every day and criticizing the government for this train crash, for this tainted milk, etc., is created a new kind of surveillance, as John, surveillance from beneath, not a monetary democracy, but certainly a monetary process to which the Communist Party, which is legitimacy is based upon performance, has to nonetheless respond to in some systemic way. So we try to focus, instead of on Mitt Romney's hair, we try to focus a little bit on the new developments in media, social media. So it was just something that we decided to focus on, something else. On the G20 point, or on the global warming point, this is the difficult issue. We have a whole chapter on the G20, and the frame of it is that we had the G7, which was the advanced economies. They can no longer deliver global public goods because their power is waning. The emerging economies, including China, cannot yet deliver the global public goods, not willing or not able. So you have this in-between global governance situation with no hegemon, but a whole set of problems. How do you deal with it? And I think, as Tony said, it's not clear to anybody how that's going to work, especially since Europe, the United States, and China are all going to be so internally focused in the coming years. How you get to global governance and figure out how to deliver common public goods is going to be one of the great challenges. One of the things we did discuss every year before the G20 meeting, we meet with the president of the G20 for that year. So this year it was President Calderon in Mexico. And he wanted to focus on green growth at that summit. Now, probably nobody remembers that because the Europe financial crisis takes over every summit. Every year there tends to be a crisis before the summit happens, so that's all that's talked about. But at that summit we talked a lot about fighting global warming instead of through only a summit agreement in Copenhagen, which didn't happen, subnational and national networks of states that have carbon trading policies that can trade with each other. The state of California, Australia, Quebec, subnational units can move forward on these low carbon growth issues and trade with each other and link up with each other beneath a global agreement. So there are some ways that global governments can maybe deliver, common public goods can be delivered in a new way that isn't at the level of the nation states or the global level. So that's the point on the G20. On the point about the House of Lords and the elders, I think we're really focused in the book on, I keep coming back to consensus-forming institutions. Meritocratic meaning, and this is an American speaker.
What does it mean, consensus-forming institutions?
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is an American speaker. Meritocracy has the idea of knowledge-based politics has so fallen in the United States that when Bill Clinton gave his speech at the Democratic Convention, he was lauded by the whole world because he had facts in what he said. Meritocracy was reduced to someone actually speaking the facts instead of making stuff up and arguing. So meritocracy, in a broader sense, we mean knowledge-based policy making. But we focus on consensus building institutions because in the case of California, and as I said in my short talk, we have direct democracy. People go and vote at the ballot box, can change the Constitution, they make different laws, and one does not connect to the other because there's no deliberative function, there's no filter through which it goes. It's exactly the type of thing that the American founding fathers, Madison and so on, worried about. Because what you get, and I mentioned we spend more in prisons than higher education, what you get is you go in the ballot box and it's perfectly rational to say my property tax is too high, I'm an old lady, and I'm paying more than my house is worth in property taxes back in 1978, and say, we want to cut property taxes. Then the same person will vote the next year and say there's too many criminals on the street, if you commit 3 felonies you have to go to prison for 25 years, but by the way, I'm not going to vote for new prisons to be built. So you end up with these decisions which on their own seem rational to the individual voter, but in the overall picture, they create unintended consequences. Retail sanity, wholesale madness. So you now have a fiscal situation in California. Property tax has never been replaced. The University of California, the future is being cut, $500 million every year. K through 12 schools are being cut back several weeks. Fire rages in the mountains, and police license fee don't pay for the policing fire, et cetera, et cetera. More prison, because we didn't build more prisons, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered 36,000 felons to be released from prison because overcrowding was violating their human rights. So you get these unintended consequences without a deliberative filter. And so consensus building institutions try to dampen down the partisan rancor, come to a conclusion, bipartisan or nonpartisan, knowledge-based policy, and that's really what is coming to be missing, especially in California, but broadly speaking in the United States. So whether that institution is peopled by eminent elders like yourself in the House of Lords, or young people, is not the issue. It's a consensus building function, which is really the issue. And I think that's it for now.
Can I just say, I think the section on California is really good because many people say that in an internet-based world we should go to more direct mechanisms of democracy, especially using referenda and so forth. And the California example shows how difficult this can be, especially when it's to some extent captured by corporate interests. So Proposition 13 has just been a dreadful thing really for California and its prospects. So I would certainly recommend that part of the book to the reader.
Only thing I would say is, to be a little bit more optimistic than Tony, but seeing something that's good, but the challenges of it. Globalization has been, a good thing in the sense that countries that weren't participants and citizens that weren't participants in, let's say, a world economy and also in the world power base are now part of it. And most importantly, technology. And I think everybody, well, actually, it's interesting. There's no heat in this building. That's about, but
we approve of that. We approve of that.
The
saving energy we are.
Keeps people awake.
Technology generally has, it has helped, really engage citizen countries all around the world. And so technology has been a very wonderful thing, but it also creates an enormous challenge in the West. Why? Because you can replace people, and you can by other means, including machines. It also puts enormous pressure on prices, including actually wages. And the West has this issue of having gotten used to wonderful consumption and entitlements that it has to pay back. So you've got a deflationary environment and lots of debts and not that much growth. So you've got a very challenging environment in the West. And that means you've got to adapt and reform. But to adapt and reform in a system where people get elected because they make promises, and these promises are generally not to hurt whoever elects them, and they have to make promises of more wonderful things, makes it much, much harder for the West to reform. So going back to the book, what we are arguing is that you need some elements, even in a democracy, where some elements are there, and you talked about the capacity to govern, the elements of sort of a civil body that's not elected, that's capacity to manage things in a country. Well, that element has been, I think, weakened in the West, and you've got to give a vote in the West to people who think of the long term, who think of the next generation, who think of some of the common goods that are essential for all citizens, and that in a short-term populist environment are much harder to address. On the other hand, the East, which has benefited a lot from globalizations, is operating under very different political environments which are less accountable to citizens. That's one of the reasons maybe what they were able to progress quite well without much interference. Those are being now challenged internally, and it's normal. As they grow up and become wealthier, citizens want a greater voice, and that transition for a lot of Eastern governments to give citizens more of a voice without becoming, let's say, California today, is going to be the challenge. So we really feel that there is a challenge on the two extremes, if you want. And you don't want to go all the way to California. You don't want to go all the way, maybe, let's say, to China. And we sort of arguing that, do you want, maybe you want two houses. One house is elected, another house is more meritocratic, but truly meritocratic. So one can check the other, but the one that's more meritocratic can at least propose and think of longer-term issues that affect society.
Yeah, I think, it's absolutely true that many people have been lifted out of poverty. But I mean, what a kind of mad world it is, because you've got 1 billion people still living close to the breadline. You've got 1 billion people who are obese or radically overweight. And as American fast food spreads across the world, you look at Japan, for example. Japan used to have the healthiest diet in the world. Now about a third of teenagers in Japan are radically overweight. And this is happening all over the place, and there's a sort of craziness to that. And I just think we've got to find a different way of living myself. I think we've come to the end of the sort of processes of industrialization that have dominated the last 150 years. And I think this applies to China, this applies to India, this applies to the West. We're living in an unsustainable world. That is the fact of the matter. We know it to be true. I don't think I've talked to a lot of Chinese leaders like my two companions on the panel, and Indian leaders too, and I think they're much more conscious than they were that we need an alternative model of development. You remember the traffic jam that stretched from Beijing through to Tibet, and people were there for like 5 days and cooking their food by the side of the road. Well, the car is supposed to be an instrument of liberty and freedom. But I mean, it isn't when you're stuck in a 5-day traffic jam or stuck in a city centre generally. So I think we've got to be much more radical in thinking about the future. We need an alternative model of economic development. We must look for a more sustainable world, and we must do more to tackle the overarching issue of climate change, because even Mayor Bloomberg now recognizes this. If you saw the storm in New York and you see the aftermath, well, imagine what would happen if you had storms 2 or 3 times as intense as that, because that's what climate change produces. It produces more and more chaotic weather, droughts and flooding. So, I mean, I seem to be the only one who finds that prospect frightening, but I do. And so I therefore think, we've got a hell of a lot of work to do to find a sort of alternative, sustainable model of development, which I think has now receded under the impacts of the financial crisis rather than made the advance one would hope for.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that. I mean, this global warming is the perfect example of the problem with the dynamic of consumer democracy that focuses on the present. After the end of the Cold War, we forgot to remember how to remember the future, because there was such a disaster. The Soviet dream, the communist dream, sacrificed everything for the future. Everything became now, it became a consumer democracy, became everything focused on plenitude of consumer goods and being satisfied now. Savings or no savings for consumption. It's very difficult in that circumstance to have people take actions today that are going to have impact in the distant future in a democracy. I mean, I just used the example, we were just in Germany with Gerhard Schroeder, whose reforms, as most people here probably know, is Agenda 21 reforms on welfare, labor, and research and development issues, are what have made Germany the most competitive country in Europe today and in many ways in the world. His reforms are very unpopular, and they didn't bear fruit for a decade. Yet he had to be elected, and he wasn't re-elected because he had to be elected in the German elections, first the states, then the federal elections. His party lost because his policies were unpopular. So just as the bond market mispriced Spanish, Italian, and Greek bonds because they were linked to the German economy, so democracy mispriced the value of Gerhard Schroeder's reform because you couldn't demonstrate the value in the short term. And that illustrates the kind of problem with democracy when you're trying to make long-term changes and asking for sacrifice now. And global warming is a perfect example of a very difficult problem to solve under democracy.
Well, with respect, I disagree.
Yeah.
I don't see why you can't take longer term decisions in a democracy. And as I said, I think there are organizations which are set up to help us do that. They include not only the civil service, but all the other monitoring organizations, the third sector groups and so on, which are trying to get us to think about the long-term future. I would see the problems as different. I think the issue we face in the world is the issue of risk. That is, we are facing risks which no other civilization has ever had to face before. These include not only global warming, but also the existence of nuclear weapons, population going up probably to 9 billion people. In 1850, there were less than 1 billion people in the world. No other civilization had to confront these risks. The problem is they have kind of all too late quality. We don't have any past experience of them. Therefore, it's very hard to take an abstract future risk seriously for many people, whether they're lay people or political leaders. So to me, the whole world is like a smoker who says, oh, well, I'll give up tomorrow. Or my granddad smoked 70 cigarettes a day and he lived till he was 100, as though that's got anything to do with it. Or who says they'll find a cure for cancer. It's the same kind of problem of coping with future risk. And I don't personally think it's got much to do with the difference between democracy and other forms of, or Western democracy and other forms of system. I think problematic in general, and I think on the whole the Western countries have been far more alert to environmental issues and long-term problems than, for example, China had until very recently, or India until very recently, or indeed African countries or Latin American ones till quite recently.